Hello and welcome to the EUROGEN webinar series. We're delighted to have you here with us this evening. Um, just before we get going, I'd like to let you know that there are 24 European reference networks covering clusters, the main medical clusters of rare, complex and low prevalence diseases. And October 2025, the 24 ERNs included just over 1,600 specialised centres located in about 375 hospitals in 27 member states and Norway. They were set up in 2017 by the European Commission and they're funded by the EU for Health programme. Now, collaboration is really the key with the European reference networks, and actually, that's one of the most innovative sides of them that we've seen as they've developed over the years. The cross collaboration, both between and across ERNs, is really increasing over time. So this webinar is a real example of that. It's not just one ERN, but 4 ERNs here. So we can bring you the benefits of the clinical expertise from across all 4, along with the Decode project, which is an EU-funded project to support medical device developers in the paediatric rare disease area. So tonight's webinar is medical device shortages and regulatory constraints. And there will be the opportunity to ask questions, so please do. I really want to thank all our esteemed speakers here this evening. We're really grateful to them for sharing their expertise. And we kick off with Professor Tom Melvin, who's Associate Professor of Medical Device Regulatory Science at the University of Galway in Ireland. And this webinar is EACME accredited, so please fill in the survey at the end. Tom, thank you so much for kicking us off this evening. You're very welcome and we're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and delighted to be with you, everyone. We could go through to the next slide. What I'll do in this introductory talk over the next 10 minutes or so is introduce a little bit of background on the medical device regulation, what has changed, and give you a sense of some of the things that will be changing in future with the regulation, in addition to talking about some of the challenges that we've seen in recent years. We could go to the next slide. So how does a medical device get to a patient? There are 3 main ways in which this can happen. The most usual way is by undergoing a notified body assessment. This happens for everything except the lowest risk medical devices, and this is the typical way that medical devices are supplied to hospitals. There are 2 other ways worthy of mention when thinking about devices used rarely. The first is a derogation pathway. This is sometimes called compassionate or humanitarian use. It's provided under Article 59 of the Medical Device Regulation, and it often applies just to a single patient. So in Europe, we very rarely give a broad derogation for a device to be applied for multiple patients or multiple member states, but it is possible. The third way that a medical device can make its way to a patient is when it's developed in-house. So the hospitals have to prepare regulatory documentation. They don't have to submit it in advance, but this is another way in which hospitals can develop medical devices locally and use them for patients. Next slide. So what has changed with regulation? We introduced directives for medical devices in Europe in the early 1990s, and in 2017, a significant revision was publicized. This was the Medical Device Regulation. It kept the same basic structure, using competent authorities to look after studies in the pre-market, notified bodies for market access, and then competent authorities again to look after safety issues. And in general, the Medical Device Regulation introduced a whole host of new processes, procedures, databases, and definitions. And this has demonstrated some implementation challenges in recent years. When we think about some of the challenges that have been seen, what you can see on the screen here is a survey that was conducted in 2024 by the Biomedical Alliance in Europe. We had responses from over 300 clinicians. Over half of them had noticed disappearing devices, and they related to a whole host of different technologies. It could be accessories for surgical robots, intravascular balloons, stents and coils used in cardiology, insulin pumps, respirators, heart valves, lots of different things. About 1/3 of them concerned the use of devices in children particularly, and about 1 in 5 of them related to devices used in the context of rare disease. Next slide. As a result of some of these challenges with disappearing devices, our regulatory system has developed a number of new terms, some of which are formally recognized and some of which are referenced in guidance documents or referred to commonly. And these all relate to medical devices that are used for particular types of situations where we have limited patient numbers. So legacy devices are often those that were produced under the Medical Device Directive. Orphan devices have a definition provided in guidance when they're supplied for use for not more than 12,000 patients annually in the European Union. And you'll also see reference to niche products. But all of these devices can have particular challenges when looking to introduce them in the European market. Next slide. What are the kind of challenges that can happen for these orphan or pediatric devices? Well, firstly, they're faced by much higher economic barriers because they have a much smaller patient population. So the return on investment and making your money back from the research and development outlay is more challenging. Because you have smaller patient populations, running clinical studies in the pre-market is also difficult, and you often have to run a longer duration for your study and have multiple sites in order to run a study. Especially for pediatric patients and implants, you're often faced with changing and developing anatomy and physiology. And these products, like all medical devices, have faced increasing regulatory costs and complexity, and we'll give a sense of that in some of the forthcoming slides. To give one particular example, on the right-hand side, you'll see Dr. William Rashkind. He developed what's commonly known as the Rashkind balloon in the 1960s. In Europe, we used to have 3 Rashkind balloons, and for a while in Europe, we had no Rashkind balloons because there was no devices available and approved under the medical device regulation. Next slide, please. What you can see on the screen here is some data that's been provided by the one remaining medical device for balloon septostomy. This is from NewMed, and you can see here the costs for the regulatory assessment that they have. So in the European Union, their costs are 135,000, and that cost recurs every 5 years. And if you compare that to other large markets like the US FDA, where it's €3,000, or Health Canada, where it's €7,000 and a one-off fee, we found that these had a significant impact on the likelihood of companies introducing their products in the EU market. Next slide, please. So what has been the activity by regulators to try and help or address this issue? Well, firstly, we have a guidance published in 2024 for orphan devices, and this led to increased work by the European Medicine Agency expert panels to offer designations and then advice to orphan device developers. One of the other things that regulators did was introduce a new part of the regulation. It's 2024-1860, and this required that if a manufacturer is going to withdraw a device, and if that could lead to a risk to public health, they had to give 6 months notice, and these were then considered by a group of regulators in what's called the Medical Device Shortage Steering Group. Apart from these granular changes to the current regulation, we are also looking at changes to the overall medical device regulation. The quote at the top, that MDR is a bureaucratic monster with loads of rules, is a quote from German Member of European Parliament Peter Liese. And across the Parliament, the Commission and the Council, they have all been busy on what needs to happen to change the medical device regulation. Next slide, please. On the 16th of December, the European Commission published a proposal to amend the medical device regulation. What are the most important changes in that proposal? Well, firstly, orphan devices that currently have a guidance will get a designation under the regulation itself. So that's not a very big change, but the second thing on the list here could have important consequences. If you have a designation as an orphan device, and if you were a legacy device, meaning approved under the directive framework, for the first time we could have grandfathering for these devices, where they will automatically be bought in and given MDR compliance. Some other changes in the proposal relate to rolling or priority reviews with notified bodies and a proposed 50% fee reduction. So if we think that the costs in Europe could be 130,000, that would be effectively halved. It's still a little bit more expensive, especially for middle risk devices when compared to the United States or Canada, but it could be an important help. And other policy work mentioned in the proposal is that the European Medicines Agency will have a new responsibility for critical medical devices, and this is somewhat similar to the Critical Medicines Initiative that EMA have led in recent years. Next slide, please. So what do we need to try and help this area and make sure that the essential devices are available for orphan and pediatric use? Firstly, I think that regulators need to shift their focus from a single market perception, which is what the initial directives sought to deliver. We need to make sure that regulators are thinking about protecting patients, and the opportunity to do things like offer EU-wide derogations when clinical communities can work with regulators to say this device needs to be protected would be an important help. For expert panels, we need to make sure that we empower them with greater methods and frameworks to help with their designation and advice work to make sure that it's consistent with regulatory expectations. For funders in Europe, I think that funding post-market registries would help a lot with some of the challenges we see in pre-market evidence generation. And I think that European reference networks could be an excellent basis for this. And recognizing that regulation is really only the end of the beginning, we need to work with the payers or health technology assessment bodies to recognize to a greater extent that these devices often come to market with limited clinical evidence, but they still need people to reimburse and pay for them to increase their availability. Next slide, please. Just to finish out, I'd like to mention one opportunity that there is currently, especially for clinicians dialed in today. We have just recently established a pediatric and rare disease panel amongst all of the thematic panels at the European Medicines Agency. This is currently open for recruitment, and the European Medicines Agency are actively looking to recruit new members to this panel. So if you're working in pediatrics or rare diseases and you'd like to roll up your sleeves and help, you can see the email there, and the European Medicines Agency will be happy to hear from you. So thank you very much. I hope that gave an introductory overview, and I look forward to talking with you again later on.
Thank you so much, Tom. I would like to invite Professor Vande Walle. Just disclosure, I am so sorry that you have to bear with me while I flick through all the slides, but we have one big presentation and I'm in control. So sorry that you have to hear, next slide please, the whole time. Johan, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Next slide. I will talk on the shortage of dialysis equipment across Europe, where you all know that dialysis is a life-saving medical device treatment for patients in CKD. My talk will mainly concentrate, next slide, on the chronic hemodialysis across different age and size groups. So I will not mention in this talk the acute topic because that's even difficult. Next slide. Now, if we look, and this work has been done by Bruno Ranchin recently, there are no pediatric specific devices for dialysis in children. There are only adaptations to adult medical devices. And as you can see in the colors on the left side, the problem is indeed not only in Europe, it's worldwide, where we have less than 20 kilograms no labeled dialysis equipment, and that even between 20 and 40, and I will show you, we have a lot of problems. Next slide. Now, is there a need for adapted medical devices? In this slide, you see on the right side that if we are looking to the different registries, it's up to 60% of all children on dialysis. So almost all children, in fact, on dialysis are less than 40 kilograms and are facing problems that the devices are or will not be labeled anymore according to the new MDR regulation. Next slide. But if we are looking to the smallest children, and that are the children less than 10 and 15 kilograms, what's about 1 on 4 children, then we have no acceptable pediatric adaptations. And not everything, it's not only the problem of not being labeled, it's also that we are at the end of the ability to taper down adult machines to children. And in this, we should even consider that it's underreporting, because in many sites, small children are simply not put on hemodialysis. Now, what are the technical needs? We need adapted extracorporeal volume. We need precise control of ultrafiltration, temperature, electrolyte, and coagulation. And we need also to have access to the new innovations that are now in the adults developed. Next slide. Now I will discuss two examples. That's the extracorporeal volume for chronic dialysis. And there on the right side, you see the minimum kilograms that is certified. And there you're seeing it's ranging from 20 to 30 kilograms. So less than that, all machines are not labeled, and many of those machines will already disappear very soon. Now, if I look to the next step, and that's the accuracy of ultrafiltration, what is critical for safetiness, there you see the same, it's 20 to 30 kilograms. Next slide. Now, you see now the slide back with that, so you see everything under 20 kilogram is simply not safe and not labeled. So the two things are going in line. Next slide. Now, just mentioning the problem of the central lines, and there we have also a major problem, that is that the number of fractures is very limited. Existing fractures are withdrawing their catheters from the market. And for example, there is in Europe only one catheter who is everywhere present and is having for many sizes, not for all sizes, catheters available. Next slide. Now, what have we observed since the introduction of the MDR? Clearly, a worsening. If it's secondary or parallel to it, I have to leave that open. But there's a problem with withdrawal of catheters, both for hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis. Pediatric adaptations to existing adult machines are disappearing. There are no or insufficient plans for pediatric adaptation for the new adult devices and the innovations. And there are less companies, so less manufacturers by merging, what means that a lot of old machines are disappearing from the market. Next slide. Now, if we are looking what happened since the introduction of the MDR, there are no existing HD monitors that has received recertification, and there are no new ones who are submitted. So, big problems. What are rescue solutions? On short term, I think we have to ensure the continued access to existing essential pediatric and orphan MDs, and maybe we should systematic monitor on the MDs to accountability from the industry. We have to facilitate labeling of existing MDs. Independent expert panels should discuss in white papers what of the existing medical devices are still appropriate, and the data to validate that can easily be obtained from ERN registries. Next slide. But I think to the year commission, you have heard there are some changes, but I think we should even go further. I think we should stimulate innovative pediatric development, and therefore we need to inventorize the unmet pediatric needs. We need to involve pediatric disease experts early in an early phase in the adult subcommittees, because having only the committee pediatrics and rare diseases, then we are too late in the process. And we should refine the existing MDR regulation commissions parallel to the EMA drug and orphan regulation, where there is mandatory a PIP program early at a submission of the adult indication. We have still further to reduce the cost for submission of the pediatric adaptations, and we have to create a realistic incentive program parallel to what has happened of the drugs. So we need to raise awareness and to spread this awareness amongst all ERNs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to invite Yazan Rawashdeh for the next presentation.
Thank you, Parmelia. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yazan Rawashdeh, and I'm a pediatric urologist, and I'm going to give you my view, or the pediatric urologist's view, on the medical device shortages. Now, pediatric urology, next slide, please, is a complex or is a specialty where we deal with complex congenital anomalies in newborns and very young patients. We also deal with a lot of rare complex conditions, a high percentage of orphan diseases. So it's a specialty that requires use of intricate miniaturized instruments, devices, and disposables. Next, please. So you can say that pediatric urology is a specialty of tubes, catheters, stents, scopes, and mainly innovation. Next slide, please. We all know that the MDR is set in the world to ensure high safety and performance standards for medical devices in the EU, but with that comes a lot of bureaucracy and costs that have to do with the getting the devices checked. So if you take the next slide, please. And with that comes a cycle of unintended consequences that we live with. So the higher the regulatory costs and complexity, combined with fewer notified bodies and several bottlenecks, leads to economic pressure on companies, and especially small-sized and medium enterprises. So they start withdrawing their devices and products from the market, and this gives a headache for us clinicians, problems for the patients, and that's what we're dealing with these days. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give you some examples from daily clinical life in pediatric urology, and this is based on a survey that we ran in the ERN eUROGEN, where we asked all centers to write in with all the shortages they are dealing with. And I would like to start with suprapubic catheter insertion, which is a very simple procedure that's done daily at all pediatric urology departments. It's very simple with a low complication rate, especially when you use the right catheter. It's an excellent method to deal with emergencies and other difficult situations, and is really ubiquitous in pediatric urology. Next slide, please. So when do we use the suprapubic catheter? Well, we use it for patients with posterior urethral valves. These are newborns, and they can be premature as well, so we need small catheters. Emergency decompression of the bladders when you have children with urinary retention, trauma, and especially when we've done urethral surgery and there's a malfunction of the transurethral catheter and you want to keep the operative site undisturbed. And it's also used for urodynamic examinations. So next slide, please. And for that, we've for many years been using the Cystofix 5 French, and this is not to do any sort of commercial for this catheter, but it's really good. You have a very nice plastic introducer, and you can pop the catheter in just by puncturing the skin. It takes under a minute. It can be done in local anesthesia. However, that catheter has disappeared within the last couple of years. Next slide, please. And now we're left using catheters that have a much larger caliber. We're using 7 French nephrostomy catheters not meant for the bladder, or the 10 French Cystofix catheter with a sharp blade introducer, as you can see on the right. And these invariably need general anesthesia. For the very small pediatric cases, improvised catheters with the use of CVP, central venous catheters, or epidural catheters have been used. And this tends to increase the complications. We see more cases of hematuria, catheter malfunction, leakage, and bladder spasms with these patients. Next slide, please. Now, just to show you how we have improvised, so instead of just popping the catheter in, now we need to, is it playing, Parmita? Yeah. So instead of just popping in, now you have to incise the skin. You have to place a trocar into the bladder and then a guide wire, and over that an introducer, which is usually used for venous access. And through that, you can put your catheter, which is not meant as a suprapubic catheter. This is an off-label fashion of dealing with the problem, increases the complication rates. And I guess that's not the intention of the MDR, but that's what we are facing on a daily basis. Next, please. One more time. Yeah. Johan mentioned that with the peritoneal dialysis catheters, yes, we are seeing more and more companies withdrawing their catheters from the market, and then we have to adapt the adult catheters, which are longer, have larger diameters, and are more rigid, and the cuff placement is not optimal. So it's a big problem, and if that continues, we will be left with no peritoneal dialysis catheters. Another thing we have observed disappearing from the market are the cystoscopes. We've been very happy for the Olympus cystoscope, which we've been using since the early 2000s. It's a sheet system, next slide please, which allows different sizes. It allows diagnostic and interventional procedures using the same optical lens, and has an excellent 5 French working channel. So you can place most of the double J cases in the small babies. Next slide. We recently wanted to acquire a new scope and found out that they have been withdrawn from the market. I'm not sure why, but the timing seems to suggest that it may be related to the new MDR. Now we need to use multiple scopes to achieve the same diagnostic and therapeutic goals. There are still scopes out there, but it's a worrying development if other manufacturers also follow suit. Many of the scopes that we have now don't have a 5 French working channel, so when you do intervention, it increases the radiation exposure times for these babies, which is suboptimal. Next slide, please. The same goes for the resectoscopes. Again, we have a very nice new resectoscope. The problem is that we can't get hold of the hooks anymore, so they're basically useless. I won't go into the details in the interest of time. Urethral stents are also being withdrawn from the market. Next slide. And when we surveyed our colleagues at the different ERN centers, as you can see on this slide, there are miscellaneous other devices that have been withdrawn. So it's generally a problem. Let me end by next slide, concluding that it's a worrying development within the field of pediatric urology and other subspecialties. Further withdrawals will undoubtedly have a negative impact on patients, especially for the niche areas and very complex orphan and premature patients. I have spent the last couple of days calling many of the representatives in Denmark, and one thing I found out is that many of them are not really aware of what's happening, and they can't really advise and don't know why the withdrawals have happened. So that's very interesting, and it's really a jungle to navigate in. Collective action is needed to turn the tide on these developments. It's very important. Next slide. We urge, therefore, the relevant bodies of the EU to acknowledge this pediatric urology orphan device issue, and that the notified bodies are encouraged to consider disease rarity and lack of alternatives when regulating medical devices. Finally, we are working on a survey which we shortly will be circulating to all ERN eUROGEN and maybe some of the other ERNs to survey the shortages and what impact it has in daily clinical life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yazan. I would like to invite Elena Arbelo for the next presentation.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Welcome, Elena.
Great. I'm Elena Arbelo. I'm a cardiologist working in Barcelona, and I'm very happy to be here talking about this very, very relevant topic. So today I'll be speaking or giving the perspective for medical devices in the cardiovascular field on behalf of the ERN Guard-Heart. And my message basically is that medical device availability, it's a question of safety itself. And I will try to argue why, even though the MDR was probably born and developed to increase safety for patients in the field, particularly of rare diseases, the lack of availability or disappearance of some devices is actually having the contrary effect. These are my disclosures. Coordinating one of the thematic areas in ERN Guard-Heart. I'm a member of the regulatory and advocacy committees at the European Society of Cardiology, and I have been part of the task force on behalf of the European Society of Cardiology, both of the orphan devices guidance and the breakthrough devices. And my disclosures with the industry. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we all remember why the public trust needed rebuilding, major device scandals, and the broader implant file investigations. So the societal message was clear. The medical device industry needed better oversight, better evidence, and better traceability. So the goal of the NDR, I believe it's legitimate and most of us support it. But the problem is that sometimes when we tighten oversight, we complicate things and we may have secondary effects as we have seen and Tom has explained. So can you go to the next slide? Before the NDR, we actually, and these slides capture it historically, for many high-risk devices, Europe had earlier access than the US. And this earlier access did not necessarily mean better, but it has shown to have mattered in terms for innovation and for patients with unmet medical needs so that they have access to the most innovative or breakthrough technology. Next. So timing is one side of the coin. The other side is what happens after you get approval. How quickly do problems emerge, and how does your system respond? So again, on this slide, you see on the left that in Europe we used to have earlier access to devices, but we also had more probability of having recalls or problems after their approval. Next. And if you look at the same thing, but in the US, comparing the standard review process to the priority review, can you click again on the slide? Again, because the timing was wrong. So you see on the left that, of course, as expected, the priority pathway took shorter time to access the market. But look at the median to highest recalls class timing. Recalls appeared significantly earlier for those devices in the priority pathway, meaning that probably the evidence that we had for that approach was not sufficient, and that careful oversight was needed after approval. So next. So taking that into account, I think we all welcomed the medical device regulation in 2017 because we were looking for improved patient safety and performance, greater transparency of the process, and also better traceability of the medical device throughout its life course. Next. And that was 2017 when that was the regulation was published to raise the bar on clinical evaluation, post-market surveillance, traceability, transparency, and in principle, all of these were pro-patient moves. So next, we all welcomed that, and the fact is that when we're now discussing in particular the cardiovascular disease devices, we see that this is a major European project, the R&D, and when they did an assessment, they showed that for high-risk cardiovascular devices, randomized trials were not typically available before CE marking. And much of the prospective evidence was not randomized and published only after CE marking. So yes, there was a legitimate evidence gap that we needed to close. The challenge is even sharper when you look at pediatric devices, and this is not only for cardiovascular devices, but in general for medical devices in children. So you see that there are relatively few trials overall. Many of them have really small sample sizes, and especially for the youngest, so the infants and the young children. And so basically what we have is that the people that need it the most and they probably need the most specialized medical devices are the ones that are not getting that evidence to actually implant them or implement them or approve them with sufficient safety. So next. The problem is that with that noble goal, we had some disadvantages or concerns that have been seen or happening in the past 5 years. So I will focus on risk of shortages, which is the topic of the webinar today. But we're seeing also less innovation in Europe. The higher cost, Tom has already explained. So getting approval and certification for new devices and also legacy devices in Europe is becoming cumbersome, especially for small and medium-sized companies. And there's a lot of shifts on where the investments are being done. And in the end, all of this translates in delayed access or even shortages for patients. Next. We must take industry survey data, of course, with care. But this was a survey that was done in MedTech in some years ago. And basically what it's saying is that innovation and investment for applying for first regulatory approval seems to be shifting towards the US, while in the past it was the contrary. Next. And now concentrating on cardiovascular medical devices, we're seeing that. This is a quite dramatic image that was published in Germany. But basically, this was showcasing the issue of very small pacemakers, a type of pacemaker, single chamber with just one lead that was used because of its small size in children, and it was discontinued. I will showcase specifically in the alternatives that that are being taken later on. Next. So why is this important for us? In rare and complex cardiovascular disease, having a specific curve or a specific size of catheter is crucial. In cardiology, or cardiovascular disease, as in many other fields, we do have a lot of interventional procedures. Many of them are done with catheters. So we're not only talking about availability or not of a particular device, but as in the case of dialysis, we have to look specifically not only at the whole, let's say, group of catheters or devices, but the specific characteristics, because you need a specific size with specific curves to reach a particular anatomy to solve a particular problem. So basically, when any of these disappear, and I will summarize what we're seeing, we as clinicians have to pivot or to substitute it with a different, less optimal option. And this is actually key. And we may be changing what we consider a safe procedure to a less safe and sometimes risky intervention, but with no other alternative. So this is important for cardiovascular disease, probably for any other diseases. Next. And this was a survey that was done by the European Society of Cardiology in 2024 across all its members, different subspecialties. And basically, over half of the people said that they have experienced some availability issues since the MDR, and critically, that they affected cases above everything, cases that involve children and patients with rare disease. And the most common missing devices were mapping and ablation catheters and stents and balloon. Exactly those tools that I was talking about that enable this interventional percutaneous activity that we do in our field. So next. We also perform within the European Society of Cardiology, and I tried to summarize it on one single slide to see what kind of devices we're seeing or having problems with. As I mentioned, and I believe I have a colleague of mine that's a pediatric interventional cardiologist, so I won't go much into detail with that, but there's plenty of problems that they are or they have experience in that field, both for treating congenital heart disease and other children-specific diseases. We're seeing shortages and problems with different diagnostic and ablation catheters and needles to access some chambers of the heart, like transeptal needles. And all of these are forcing the clinicians to adapt to whatever we have. And that sometimes doesn't mean better safety. We've also seen in the acute coronary or the acute cardiac care units some issues with temporary pacing wires, temporary pacemakers, patches, etc. Each of them may have more or less impact on alternatives for treating a patient or how safe you do it. And then there are things that we use across the cardiovascular field, like guide wires, diagnostic catheter, access sheath, etc. Some of them are also have been removed from the market. Coincidentally with the MDR. I cannot affirm that it's because of the MDR, but temporarily it has been around the same time. Next. Now I'm going to give you several examples. This one was already mentioned by Tom Melvin, the balloon atrial septostomy tool, so I won't go into details, but this has created some problems in very early life-saving atrial, life-saving cardiac intervention in very, very small children. Next. Same for specific type of stenting and stents and that have been approved for aortic coarctation and other specific pediatric and congenital heart disease. So clinicians have needed to move and use other alternatives, oftentimes off-label, and that probably were not as optimal or are not as optimal as the old alternatives were. Next. This is the case I mentioned before. We have the very small pacemaker. This is the Microni. This was a very tiny size. It's actually a very old, simple pacemaker, just one lead. But for very small children, it was very useful. It allowed placing the battery in a prepectoral area, which is usually, or intrapectoral area, which is usually more convenient. And without it, with the pediatric cardiologists are needing to go to either use bigger sizes with the inconvenience and larger pockets and more risk of erosion and infection in very small children, or find alternative placing locations like in the abdomen, use the leadless pacemakers, which are not a good option for very small children because the battery, up until now, you cannot remove them. So when that battery runs out in a very small heart, you will need to implant a second pacemaker, and that is complicating very much the management of heart blocks and bradycardia in very small children. Next. Same happens for ablation or the electrophysiology field, but it impacts more the pediatric field, but not only, also the adult field. Some of the curves of these catheters are being taken away off the market. And again, I want to highlight that I'm not completely sure that this is a secondary effect of the MDR, or that some companies have optimized their portfolio with the excuse of the MDR. In any case, some of the very smaller curves are not available nowadays, and having to maneuver with the bigger curve in a very small heart, or which can be a woman's heart, it doesn't necessarily need to be a child, makes the procedure sometimes more difficult and less successful. So that's another issue. The same happens for mapping catheters. There are catheters that were only or seldomly used just because with the conventional ones, you can map most of the arrhythmias, but sometimes we needed to go deep in the veins of the coronary sinus, and we needed small-sized multipolar mapping catheters that are disappearing. You have to maneuver with larger catheters in the coronary sinus, which is sometimes risky. You risk perforations, or you need to map epicardially, which is a different route with its own associated risks. Next. So how do we turn this around? I think that as ERNs and the medical field in general, we can really contribute by using our registries. All of us, especially in the rare disease with the ERN, have many ongoing registries. I don't know about the others in the Guard-Heart, the cardiovascular one. They are mostly clinical. They don't revolve around medical devices, but I'm sure that we can use our platform to be able to monitor and give post-market surveillance evidence to monitor this off-label use and provide more guidance in the field of orphan devices. Of course, we need to ensure data quality, use standardized definitions, and be able to ensure interoperability so that this can be used also by regulatory agencies for the monitoring of medical devices. Next. So another thing we can also do, and we have tried in the past to do, is to monitor what is happening at the moment, find where our procedures or our patients with particular specific devices have what I call the single source. That means that you only have one catheter, like Tom was explaining about atrial septostomy, that we may risk having problems in treating our patients if that only source, meaning device itself or size or characteristic, as I said. And I think as ERNs, we can support or try to map, detect the problem before it reaches the crisis point. We can help the evidence acceleration. And of course, I really believe that as ERNs, we can help the regulatory dialogue, and we should do it. We should get involved as clinicians more into these discussions at a high level at the European Commission or the European Union. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elena. I would like to invite Thomas Krasemann for the next presentation. We'll open up the first slide. Welcome, Thomas. If you could unmute yourself, then we can start. Oh, Thomas, you should unmute yourself.
Oh dear.
Yes.
Okay, once more. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. And I have the nice task to proceed of a sort of case presentation. And I will go, if you go to the next slide, about the transposition of the great arteries and the septostomy balloon that was mentioned earlier, because I guess many of the audience are not pediatric cardiologists and have no real idea what it's all about. So transposition of the great arteries is a congenital heart disease where the aorta arises from the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery from the left ventricle. In other words, there's no mixing of the oxygenated and the desoxygenated blood. To survive, the children need a little vessel, the ductus arteriosus botali, between the pulmonary artery and the aorta, which is a fetal structure, and a gap between the two collecting chambers of the heart. So next slide. About half of the children, and there are only about 2,000 per year born in Europe, need an immediate help. And the first procedure of its kind was done by William Rashkind in 1965, the first intracardiac intervention ever done. So he introduced a balloon catheter from the femoral vein through a foramen overlay, a structure that is like a flat valve, and so you can enter it from the right but not from the left. He increased the balloon size on the left side and pulled it with brute force through the septum, making a larger hole, and thus the desoxygenated and oxygenated blood can mix. Next slide. The standard approach is through the femoral vein. You need a 7 French sheath, and you think a 7 French sheath is not that big, but 7 French has an outer diameter of 2.6, 2.8 millimeters, and the femoral vein in an infant is small, depending on the weight, and we have even premature babies needing this intervention. So next slide. An alternative route is going through the umbilical cord, and the umbilical vein diameter is much bigger. And the advantage is you don't need a sheath. You can introduce the catheter directly through the umbilical cord into the right atrium and through the hole into the left atrium. Next slide. It's typically done on the ICU or on the ward with echocardiographical guidance only, whilst of course, during Will Rashkin's time, it was done under fluoroscopy. Next slide. So the standard balloon, more or less all over the world, was the Edwards-Miller septostomy balloon, which is a compliant balloon. That means you can increase the size of the balloon by giving more fluid into the tip, into the balloon. And the tip was totally atraumatic. So that was the one to use through the umbilical vein. Next slide. But Edwards withdrew the septostomy catheters because somewhere in the United States, somebody used the wrong sheath, a too small sheath. Some balloon didn't deflate appropriately. Some fragments came off. And of course, there was an insurance problem. So they withdrew worldwide, except Japan, because there was no alternative available. In Europe, there was one. Next slide. And that it was a NewMed septostomy balloon, the Z5 balloon. The Z5 balloon, as you see on the image below, is completely different. It's not a compliant. It's a non-compliant balloon, so you can only inflate it to the diameter of either 9.5 or 13.5 millimeters, depending on the balloon you use. It does not downwing completely, as it is not compliant. It is not as atraumatic. Hence, there is a little lumen where you can introduce a guide wire. Over this, you can introduce the balloon. And then you can do it from the groin with a sheath. So many people, because it needs a guide wire, in most of the cases, do it under fluoroscopy, in other words, with X-ray, whilst it's otherwise a pure echocardiographically guided procedure. Next slide. Well, we want the Miller catheter back, of course, but Edwards told me, well, the costs of the MDR are that high, we will not do that, because I had them on the phone and they said, yeah, well, actually, for insurance reasons, we'll withdraw, but we are not interested in bringing it back to the market. Well, till now. Interestingly, in the United States, a few months or 3 years after withdrawal, a short time after withdrawal, they applied for FDA clearance again, and that was granted in August 2022. And in Europe, we only had the Z5 balloon, and we wanted the Z6 balloon, which is also from NewMed, but has a less traumatic tip. But that only could be done with derogation, because NewMed, of course, has more than one product, which they need to pay 145,000 euros for. Next one. So I checked Google AI and asked, well, tell me about the Edwards septostomy balloon. And this is what they said. Edwards doesn't currently market a dedicated septostomy balloon under the MDR in Europe, leading to shortages. The market relies on older devices like NewMed Z5 or newer unmarked ones, the Z6, for example, and so forth. The interesting thing is, without asking for that, Google AI said the EU medical device regulation has made it harder for these neat pediatric devices, causing supply issues, though specific Edwards products like the Sapien valves have MDR compliance for other users. Next slide. So with the currently available septostomy catheters, transumbilical, so through the umbilical cord, access is not really possible. So we use alternative balloon. So we use radiation for the alternative balloons in many cases. So we need alternative devices, not only for Rawashdeh balloons. We need for stents that we as pediatric cardiologists use off-label a lot. We are very creative. So next slide. From the European Association of European Pediatric and Congenital Cardiologists, we made an alternative devices database. So if people had experience with something that you could use as an alternative for a device, a catheter, a balloon that taken from market, pediatric cardiologists look for other things. We look for balloons used in peripheral vessels in adults. We use catheters from different companies and so forth and so forth. But we should not need this. I think it would be better to have rules for the niche products. Next one. So what is the future? I've been in contact with Alan Tower, who is the chief executive of NUMED for Children. And he was telling me that it was extremely difficult for them to get MDR approval because it cost a lot of money. And remember the cost that Tom mentioned in his first slides of 145,000 euro or something per device is only the cost that the regulatory body gets. So a company has more costs to provide all the data, etc. And that frequently doubles or triples the costs of the fees of the regulatory body. And NUMED has had 20 devices, balloons, and so forth on the market, mainly for children. And currently we only have 10 in Europe available anymore. So this is really sad. Next one. With that, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity. And there are lots and lots and lots of other things that we could talk about. But just by this simple life-saving procedure, where you see that Edward said, well, actually, it's too expensive to apply for this because we will not get our monies back. We see that the responsibility for these children lies with us, and we need to find solutions, and we need to change the EU MDR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to hand over to Marc Gewillig for the next presentation. Marc, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I cannot see you, however. I'm not sure if your camera is working, but we can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. Can I have next slide, please? This was the problem from conversion MDD to MDR. So 500,000 devices needed to be recertified. And in the beginning, there were too few notified bodies. The interpretation of the rules was very unclear. And so we ran out of time. The cost was extremely high. And the predictability of the final result after a notified body assessment was also very speculative. Next slide, please. This slide already was shown by Tom Melvin, showing that the cost in Europe is more than a tenfold than it is now in the United States and in Canada. That was a prediction. This slide actually dates from 2022. Next slide will show you that unfortunately things are even getting worse. Sorry, this slide shows you the conversion from MDD, where getting and keeping a device on the market was about $15,000 for an American company. It has been, the estimation was $142,000, but the next slide shows you that a partial investigation by the notified body. Look at the bottom right. This is a partial estimation, the partial billing for a single line of a company reaches easily 94,000, and probably the total cost for a single line will cost between $150,000 and $200,000 for American companies in order to stay in Europe. And the letters in red are from the CEO telling me that the charges are so high that this company is actually strongly considering to pull out of the European community if things don't change. Next slide, please. Well, a few things have changed. What has changed the last 2 years? Well, the definition of orphan devices has been improved. The wet technologies have been better defined. Expert panels have been better defined. The EMA has been allowed to give a pre-market voluntary consultation. However, it's not binding for a notified body. And also conditional certification with more substantial post-marketal clinical follow-up has been installed. The big problem is that notified bodies can judge themselves if they want to follow this line, if they want to deal with a device, being it an orphan device, if they want to use expert panels in their assessment. There is no obligation, and as you know, there's also no discussion possible between the company and the notified body. So in practice, as far as we know now, there is one single notified body applying the regulation of orphan devices in their assessment of the devices. So that's still not good, but there is some hope. A month ago, here you see a proposal for a new regulation. So not the MDR 2.0, but I mean an improvement of the MDR. It is still hot. The ink isn't dry yet, but allow me to give you a few examples which are promising, but it's still a long ways to go. Tom Melvin, by the way, did mention a few of those. First of all, the Commission did realize that some requirements for the assessment were overly complex, burdensome, and lengthy. Next. And indeed, this is already a big change. 5 years ago, when I started to be involved into getting this regulatory problems, the overall idea in the Commission was that MDR was very good and was not creating any problems. Since then, in this proposal, what we can read over there is that the application of the legal requirements are insufficiently aligned. The mechanisms, the coordination mechanisms, are felt to be not very effective and efficient. There is insufficient technical and regulatory advice available at the European level. Adaptive pathways for orphan and niche devices actually do not exist, and other things. So one big thing that we already obtained was, at the Commission, they do realize that there is a problem with MDR, especially with niche devices and orphan devices. Next slide, please. And here also, that's some of the work of many of you guys that are listening right now. This proposal, so published a month ago, is actually a response from a request from the European Parliament. And so what we learned from there is contacting our parliamentary representatives in Strasbourg and Brussels has had an effect. Also, all the clinicians that did contact their ministries got some effect at the Commission, and here you see all the countries mentioned of the member states that did influence that proposal, and also some numerous stakeholders from Germany, Belgium, and France. And so the goal of this proposal is to simplify it and get it leaner and more cost effective in order to get things through MDR. Next slide, please. What are the nice things in that new regulation? Well, an even better definition of the well-established technologies, and the use of a central IT tool provided by EURNICA in order to avoid interruption or discontinuation of medical devices. The experience has learned, however, that once a company has decided to withdraw it from the market, and it is also withdrawn then from the world market, I mean, their experience, their machines, their labor people are gone, and it is very, very difficult to reinstall it. I mean, this will be good for if a device still stays somewhere in the world market. For breakthrough devices and orphan devices, better criteria, expert panels, and priority reviews are being recommended. Also, a much bigger role for derogation for both the Commission and the competent authorities in several countries. And that is very important. You have all heard about the Rashkin balloon that had been authorized through derogation in several countries. I must say that it's really a pain in the neck in order to get it through and keep it through, because it needs an evaluation, re-evaluation every 6 months. You have to say what has been done and things like that. That is not a way to work. Grandfathering of legacy orphan devices has better been structured. Very important. The proposal recommends a structured dialogue pre and post submission between the manufacturer and the notified body. We think that it is extremely important so that the manufacturer knows which pathway he will be able to go, whether orphan device will be possible. Another thing is, right now, every 5 years, a company has to go through everything all over again and reinvest all that money and all that effort. That will be delayed. Also, remote audits will be possible. Safety updates will be easier and things like that. Next slide, please. The very important, and Tom already mentioned it, he was speaking about halving the cost, but the European Commission is thinking about setting reductions and set a level and structure of notified body fees for orphan devices. Again, extremely important. Also, an ombudsperson, where if there is a dispute between a manufacturer and a notified body, is extremely important. Nowadays, the only thing a manufacturer can do is either go to court, and you all know that going to court will take you 5 to 10 years to get a point. By then, I mean, either the company is bankrupt or the device has been taken off the market for a long time. Also, the power and the importance of expert panels will be broadened. There will be a higher degree of digitalization. And last but not least, a better coordination between big societies. I mean, I think most of us do have the feeling that if, for instance, if there is an FDA approval, a Canadian approval, a Japanese approval, that things should be easier for a company to get also a European approval, and vice versa. All this sounds very exciting. However, as this over here is just a proposal, and a proposal like this typically now has to go to Parliament and to the European Council, and then it will make 2 circles over again. And a couple of months ago, I was told that the typical turnover from proposal to a new regulation like the MDR 2.0, which we all look very much forward to, that might take 9 years. I repeat, 9 years. So next slide. In the meantime, we have to stick with what's going on. The notified bodies, I think there's still too few. Most notified bodies are still very uneasy with the different pathways already defined, like orphan devices, wet technology, conditional approval, and things like that. Notified bodies are too much run by lawyers, and we all know that they have an excessive risk aversion, and also too much run by business administrators, where profit is the final goal. Also, the controls can be improved, and unfortunately, too few notified bodies work with physicians which do have some clinical experience, real clinical experience, and are not really risk aversive. There is some progress, but there is still a long way to go, and especially the MDR 2.0, which will the next goal is still not out there. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marc. I would like to invite Andreas Kohl to come over to this side and start his presentation. I will move over to the first slide.
Thank you very much, everyone who was speaking in front of me, before me. Actually, I'm very happy to be one representative of many in the European Union, because small and middle-sized companies, I rarely have a speaker. And in a dominated field of big American or multinational companies, I think, especially now in the time of global change, we should strengthen our position in Europe and look into what we can do for the medical device industry in general, number one, but also for particular devices where we are specifically focused in, and that is the pediatric or congenital heart disease. Next slide, please. So let me give you some facts here that have been missing during the presentations, but it has been mentioned. We have a bureaucratic monster, which is shown in the current situation. Right now we are in a situation where we have about 50 accredited notified bodies. And let's call them with average 30 auditors. That was the situation in 2024. So there were about 26,000 certificates that have been submitted under MDR, and about nearly 9,000 that have been recertified under MDR. Now, certification time, or better to say, it's about nearly 17,000 certificates are currently open for a renewal. Okay, that's the current situation. Now, next slide, please. Thank you. The average time of a notified body is about 18 months, taking the technical documentation for an approval process. Taking all the medical devices that need to be reassessed, it would take us about 17.3 years, okay, to recertify or to certify all the medical devices. And every 5 years, a recertification, obviously, right now is necessary. And that would take us another 26 years. So there is some lack in taking care of this, and I think that wasn't being aware for many stakeholders here, that there is such a complicated situation. Next slide, please. So what is the effects for the companies? It has been mentioned before: higher bureaucratic expenditures, more regulations, rework the whole regulatory system, external consultants, etc., etc. That all increases the cost majorly. These are all based facts. These are not only our numbers, but these are facts that are openly available. Next slide, please. Consequences are obviously that companies will reduce their portfolio. That's obviously what we heard, and that is in progress since a few years now, since the companies realized that MDR is putting a bureaucratic burden and a cost burden on the medical devices. Most companies, they will cut their portfolio, and obviously pediatric and niche professions are the ones that are cut first. That is not nice to see, but ideally, we don't want to have a monopoly of a few companies. And secondly, I think it is important that we make doctors use products out of their intended use. So for their intended use, it's very important. Possible solutions have been mentioned as well: create EU databases, create EU expert panels, MDR amendments is something that could be a very fast and efficient way where changing MDR has been taken so many years, and all of the companies need to approve that. And that has been, I think that has been a long time process. So having amendments to the current MDR is one part that could be a possible pathway to increase the speed of changes into the current MDR. And obviously, state-of-the-art technology should be, I wouldn't call it easier to market, but there should be an access way to have innovation available in Europe. And obviously, same applies to the innovation of niche products. And well, that's a quick overview on what a small company faces with and what also the stakeholders in the medical devices are facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We would like to summarize the presentations that were given. To do so, I would like to invite Anneliene and Tom to give a short overview and hand over to the discussion section. So Anneliene and Tom, I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much for being here. And it's our pleasure to try and provide a summary, but also have the possibility to answer some of the questions. It's always a bit of a challenge to write a summary upfront before the webinar has started, but Tom and I will try to do our best. And maybe for that, we've made 2 slides. I think I'm happy to get started, and then Tom gives additional feedback if needed. But I think what we have increasingly realized, but also has become very well known throughout this webinar, is that we have a critical dependence on specialized devices. And that for people with rare diseases, these are truly essential, and also in the pediatric session, are truly essential to keep or to have novel, specialized, low-volume medical devices. There are a number of key drivers against these shortages. I think the first one is the small patient populations that we work in, the complex manufacturing, the regulatory requirements, the cost connected to regulatory requirements, the supply chain fragility, and the limited redundancy that we are facing in this situation. And most importantly, also the discontinuation of legacy devices after the introduction of the MDR without true alternatives being there. A number of the specialists today have also indicated that this has a significant impact on patients and clinicians. So we've had the possibility of no longer being able to provide the required or resistant treatment. We've been seen a situation where there was a forced usage of suboptimal or off-label alternatives, and there was an increased risk due to certain instruments no longer being able. On the next slide, we also have discussed throughout this webinar the regulatory challenges, the fact that we currently have no specific orphan device instrument, although having a guidance for both for orphan devices and breakthrough devices. But that is absolutely not sufficient as present, and that we do face still a limited regulatory flexibility for emergency access or compassionate use programs or pediatric investigation plans or anything connected to this. And that there is truly a misalignment between regulatory timelines. The question is, besides awaiting the 9 years that is mentioned for the changes in the medical device regulation, let's hope it's a bit faster. I do think there are a couple of solutions that all of us have been mentioning. And I think one is the investment in supporting the development of novel orphan devices, to have a better organization of a warning system of some sort, a mandatory shortage reporting, to increase the incentives for developers and manufacturers. We currently are in a situation that are very limited grants, but also there's really no financial incentive to continue to develop a device. So no exclusivity, no tax credits, all of the instruments that are there in either drugs or actually in the United States. To to stimulate public-private partnerships and academic manufacturing support. And I think also to increase regulatory and HTA acceptance of uncertainty of evidence. And I think these collective efforts are truly needed from both regulators, manufacturers, all of the clinicians like you're present here today, but also patient advocates group to truly make a decisive step forward in safety, access, and sustainability. Tom, any additions before we go into the last 10 minutes of questions?
Thank you, Anneliene. I think you've summed things up very nicely. To me, I think back to 2021 when I used to work as a regulator, and I was one of the first regulators who was informed by clinicians that we have a problem here with disappearing devices. As we learned in these sessions, it's going to take some years to get to a better framework and a clearer pathway that both protects essential devices currently and promotes the introduction of novel devices for pediatrics and rare diseases. But I think over the last years, since 2021, when this was first reported to regulators, I think we've certainly gotten regulators' attention. We have lots of provisions proposed in the new MDR. And I guess the key thing that I think I've learned a lot from working as a regulator in the first implementation phase of MDR is that we have to have a lot more conversations, exactly like you're saying, bringing the stakeholders together and figuring out how do we operationalize. Changing the law is only the very first part of a causal chain to shifting outcomes of concern. So I think we have a lot more work to do here, but I think we've managed to make some progress in recent years. So I guess...
Yeah, I flipped through the questions. There are quite a number and we have 6 minutes left. So maybe practically, and a number of them are actually comments rather than questions, but maybe to turn into, there are, I think, 3 questions related to cost, the fact that the revisions propose a 50% reduction, whether that's sufficient. And maybe is it an idea that I give that one back to you, Tom?
When I was looking through the questions, I was thinking, Andreas, of maybe coming to you. When I think about this, as we mentioned in the presentation, if you're charged 130,000 to get your CE mark and that's halved, it's still quite a large figure. And especially for the middle risk devices, when you look at Canada or the United States, where they charge 3,000 or 5,000 euro, it's very different. So I guess I'd be really interested to hear, Andreas, would a 50% reduction shift your strategies for current or future products? It would be really interesting to hear.
To be honest, I think it depends a little bit on the device itself. Okay, you can't generally say that 50% reduction helps, but yeah, it is a start. Okay, and especially comparing US prices versus European prices, there is a major difference, which is for small companies. Like also NewMade and us, we are really hurt by it, and it is a cost that is not only related, as mentioned before, to the regulatory pathway itself. It's also, or to the cost of the notified body itself. It's also the cost that you have to do prior to this, and also investigational studies and all the regulatory that you need to have in place. It's quite a very big burden, I must say. Yeah. So 50% not enough, no.
Maybe another question that I fished out of the extensive list of questions is, and it's about a specific ICBPS device, but the fact that some of the markets are too small, and if that's actually the only reason. Anyone wanting to take on that question? I don't know the particular condition, ICBPS.
Maybe Yazan, if you could maybe speak to that one. We have a couple of questions talking about instillate fluids for things like interstitial cystitis, and one question mentioning that a sterile version that used to be available was withdrawn because the market wasn't sufficient. I'm not sure, Yazan, if you've seen or heard anything about those types of products.
Thank you for the question. I have no experience in that, but we have similar problems because I'm a pediatric urologist. with disappearing disposables as well. And it's been a big problem, especially as I showed the suprapubic catheter, which is a very simple thing. And all of a sudden we have to use epidural catheters in the bladder and things like that. So we hope that things will change. But it is a general problem in urology, I can tell.
I saw one interesting question here, or one interesting comment that companies will shift their device registration into FDA or the US. FDA is not only an approval for the US market, it's also a general approval for the rest of the world or most of the countries of the world. So it's either CE approval or it is the FDA approval. So when companies decide to go out of the European market, that means products will be available outside of Europe if they have FDA approval, but they will not be available in the EU, and novelty products as well. So I think, yeah, we will face probably a lack of innovation, and that is a good point that was mentioned here. You know, but we should be strong enough to open pathways that we guarantee new devices also on the European market.
And maybe here, as an addition, we do have quite a number of countries like Singapore, like also a number of Asian countries, African countries, Australia, that actually do follow the FDA advice and then take over that advice for niche products and orphan devices.
Perhaps one other comment, if I may. There are some companies who have a whole range, for example, of cardiac catheters, starting from very large ones down to pediatric sizes. And one of the companies told us they withdraw all 4 French catheters because they do not sell enough. We lobbied and we did a lot, and they reminded them of their responsibilities also for the society and the little patients. And yes, they said, okay, we will not stop the production completely. We'll bring the catheter back, which has not been yet withdrawn. But perhaps an incentive would be if they produce pediatric or orphan or devices for orphan diseases, that they then have a longer patent or whatever, as it is done with drugs as well, because then the withdrawal at least might not happen as frequently as it is done now.
May I add something? I think that another possible solution for this situation also is like EMA has for the critical medicines list to have a critical medical devices list. So this way there is some protection so that there cannot be market influences based on only profit made by the company, but the very vulnerable that do not have any other alternative are protected. So this is something that could be possibly considered, because we have that for drugs already. Tom, I see you nodding because we're working discussing this.
No, thank you, Elena. I think we mentioned it earlier, but trying to be more proactive in protecting further devices from disappearing, I think that's a really important area that, regardless of the transition to getting the new rules and getting them implemented, I'm often when I reflect on this, I remember that through all of COVID, we did not issue any EU-wide derogation to protect a device when it was losing its CE mark. So that was the biggest pandemic, hopefully, of our time, and the EU didn't jump in to protect devices and allow them to market without a CE mark. I think if we can find a way, right now in the system, it's the Medical Device Shortages Steering Group, but I think that's solely regulators who come together. If we could get them interacting more with expert panel members and clinical societies, we can get more proactive. So I hope that some of these responsibilities that EMA are proposed to get for critical devices, if we can get some clinicians to the table, create a list and get more proactive, you could see some very useful things happening there.
Maybe one additional thing. There were a number of questions also of, is there actually funding for rare disease, for orphan devices? There is, to a very, very limited extent. We've seen a call last year on orphan device clinical trials. We do see them coming back in the overarching Horizon Europe programs and things like the EIC calls. We have heard there were efforts foreseen in the ERN program for rare diseases, but we've yet to see them coming about. So that is truly one of the things of that is needed, is more funding to develop these and indeed the accompanying funding later on throughout the procedures, regulatory procedures.
Anneliene, I'm just looking through the questions here to see. Hopefully, we might have time maybe for one more, Pamida, if that's
definitely.
okay. I see here one question: can we associate all rare disease patients and parents associations to push them in the EU for greater justice in this area? I'm not sure if anyone would like
Yeah,
to.
shall I at least try what has been done? So I think 2 years ago there was an effort to note the issue of despairing devices. That was a letter signed by a lot of the ERNs that actually was co-signed also by EURODIS, which is the European Association for Rare Diseases, but also by EPF, the overarching European Patient Organization. That's not enough. It wasn't enough, but there is an absolute interest at EURODIS and also a number of smaller patient organizations. Having said that, it hasn't actually resulted in something that is available right now. And I think it will also require continuous efforts over the next 2 to 5 years to truly make the push for this.
Thank you. I am not completely sure if we answered all the questions. I've lost track as there were many. And it is a very important topic, obviously, and seeing of the many attendees and the many questions, we could maybe do perhaps a part 2 of this topic if people are interested in it. So we send out a post-webinar survey. So please fill that in and also leave in the comment section at the very end of that survey if you would like a part 2 of this webinar. We can maybe do more. So please fill it in because you will also get an EACME certificate if you fill that in within 2 weeks' time. The webinar has been recorded, so you will receive a link for the recording from me tomorrow via email. Again, I'm sorry if I didn't get your question in time, but it was a big one, so I think it's good if we round up. I would like to thank you all, the presenters, for being here. It was very interesting. I very much enjoyed it, and I think it's very good that we do this. We need to raise more awareness and get the right people involved. So yeah, with that, I would like to end this session and wish you all a very pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.